Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Gina Smarecki. I am the Cybersecurity Events Manager at PDI, and I'll be your host for today's live webinar. So today we're featuring three of our cybersecurity subject matter experts, and we're excited to present some real-world insights and proven strategies to bridge the gap between IT security and business risk management. If you all have questions during the presentation, please submit them in the Q&A tab. We are planning to leave some time at the end for questions, but may be able to take them as we're going if that works out. This webinar is being recorded, and just so you know, you will receive an email with a link to watch the recording as well. So before I introduce the speakers today, some of you may already heard the exciting news about this huge milestone in our 25-year journey in this industry. Newspire has joined forces with PDI Technologies, and we're working on rebranding everything to our new name, which is PDI Security and Network Solutions. I'm going to put a link in the chat where you can learn more about this transition, especially for customers. But it is important to note that we are the same team, same people, same mission, just getting a new name and a lot more resources behind us. All right, so there's that link. Let's go here. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers today, J.R. Cunningham, Mike Mellor, and Phillip Smith. JR is the Chief Security Officer and is responsible for the company's global security program and consulting organization. With 27 years of experience, he's an innovator and premier thinker in cybersecurity and risk management. Mike is a VP of Cybersecurity Consulting and has over 30 years of experience in information technology. He's got extensive experience in strategic planning, information security program development, information security and IT management, and he provides advisory services for a wide range of clients from varied industries. Phillip is a Senior Director of Security and Compliance. He's a veteran of both the information security and military intelligence communities, and he has nearly 2 decades of experience taking a pragmatic approach to technology and security across both large enterprises and small to medium-sized businesses. So welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today. All right, so before I hand it over again, we'd like to get your input on our poll. So let me go ahead and launch the poll here. Where's my control that? Here we are. All right. So the question reads, which of these are your biggest challenge when communicating cybersecurity risks and their impact? Translating security concerns into business language, getting past budget objections, engaging non-technical stakeholders, or compliance and governance roadblocks. So if everyone would go ahead and take a vote there, we'll give it a second to cast the votes. I'll turn it over to JR for a little commentary while we're waiting for the votes to come in.
Great. Thanks, Gina. And Mike and Phillip, thank you so much for joining. You two are the best in the business, and so it's a pleasure to do this. Everyone who's attending, thank you very much for being on this one. This is one of those parts of our profession that is as much art as it is science. The risk management and communicating about risk management is hard, and in my experience, it's been one of the most difficult parts of my personal and professional journey. So these four, obviously, the easy answer is all of the above. I know for me, one of the struggles that I've had is continuing to be a practicing cybersecurity professional and stay sharp on the tech while trying to communicate with non-technical, non-business stakeholders about risk. And so that's been a challenge for me. It's been something I've had to work on through the years, and certainly I think that's where a lot of the interpersonal communication and the soft skills become more important to our profession. So thanks for joining us. Hopefully you get some good content out of this today. Really excited to see what folks vote on here as the most difficult.
Yeah, and it looks like we've got a good number of participants. So let me end the poll here and share the results. So everyone should be able to see that. Actually, we got a varied answers for all four of them. So with the number one being translating security concerns into business language.
Not surprising. Mike, Philip, anything here surprise you in the results that we got? Seems a pretty even distribution among those first three.
Yeah, I think that the translating them into business concerns eking out on the top is not surprising at all.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
not surprised either.
Certainly a struggle for all of us. Well, let's see if we can provide some nuggets here. Really, the goal for today is to talk about some of the realities of communicating risk in cybersecurity to business stakeholders. We're going to talk a little bit about the risk equation and how to turn cybersecurity into a business conversation and get it out of that technical conversation that it often wants to be. We're going to go over some practical methods for how do we take a security program and align it with business goals and objectives. And really, our goal is to not turn this into a thou shalt do this. We really wanted to share some stories from Mike, Philip, and myself on things that we've seen, successes and failures that we've had over the course of the last 2-3 decades, and hopefully we can provide you with some sort of a nugget that will help you in your journey regarding risk and cyber. And finally, some takeaways. We intend to have some time for Q&A. If you do have a question and we don't get to it, we certainly will make time for it and respond to you after the webinar. So what's going on out there with risk and communicating risk, cyber risk to the business? This is a struggle that we hear about as a managed security services provider. We hear about this all the time. IT and security teams are really struggling to communicate risk to business leadership. We're really good at talking about vulnerabilities. We're really good at talking about controls, but we tend to struggle when it is time to talk about risk in terms that the business can understand and tie those risks into the other risks that a business faces. There is this widening gap between the language of cybersecurity and the language of business decision making. And that's not only because of the obvious, which is the cybersecurity industry is changing rapidly, the tech is changing, obviously AI and all of the things that come along with AI and machine learning, LLMs are changing the language, but also look at the business environment. Business is fundamentally changing as well. How we do business, how we go to market, how we engage customers, the risks involved in doing business, the social dynamics of business. All of these things are changing in a way that is faster than business change, probably in the last 150, 200 years. You put those two things together and it becomes really difficult to communicate cybersecurity risk to business leaders in a way that's effective. This is really important. It's a big problem. And if you look at what the National Association of Corporate Directors has published, they talk about cyber risk as it can't be viewed as a technology problem. It has to be viewed as a business risk issue. So boards and executives want more business-focused communication around cybersecurity risk. They don't know how to ask for it, and often we don't know how to give it. So that's kind of the reality on the ground. Mike, I know you have a very interesting perspective on this because you've been a CIO and a CISO, which, by the way, that makes you very rare in our industry. We're very fortunate to have you here. You've told me some stories over the years, and there's one that particularly sticks out regarding risk from a business context or a mission context, and communicating that on the cyber side. Would you be willing to share that again
Sure.
with the whole group? It's just really powerful, and I think everybody would benefit from hearing it.
Sure. This specific story is in the healthcare world. And there was a real, and in healthcare, I'll just say, because I've spent so many years in healthcare, there's a real disconnect between IT and the mission that they provide, support for. A lot of times IT people see themselves as, I take care of the infrastructure. What happens with it isn't necessarily connected. So we had a situation where a PACS system, which is the radiology system, was experiencing a lot of problems. In this real world example, it was at a trauma center. Trauma center, they can't have downtime. So much so that 30 minutes is life or death. So when the system was having problems, it was really hard communicating to the IT staff and the leadership over there that, and I was part of that group, why it's important for them to take their customer, which is radiology, seriously. So what I had to do is I had to put the IT staff in front of the radiologist and have the radiologist explain to them what system downtime means to them. And it was a life and death conversation. It could be your loved one in a trauma room, and you could be waiting for them to do something to help them live or die, and they can't do it because your systems or our systems are all down. It was eye-opening for this team, specifically the director. His eyes got huge. He changed his focus in that moment. You saw it change, and going forward, he never looked back. He said, okay, I understand there is a connection between the systems that I'm supporting and a real world life or death situation. Kind of impactful.
Very much so, Mike. And I think it really, even though this is certainly an extreme example because we're talking about life and death, I think it brings home the point of we as cyber practitioners, it's incumbent upon us to understand what a business or an organization does and what makes it unique and what's critical about it, and really, what makes it tick. And that helps us be more effective at our mission of protecting the organization. Would like to talk a little bit about breaking down risk in order to be able to do that. I think everybody on this call, both panelists as well as the people participating, have all been in those moments where we as practitioners start talking about something that we know is a critical risk, and we just watch the eyes glaze over of the people in front of us, right? We get talking about tech, we get talking about very specific details and minutiae, and we lose the audience. And so what's worked really well for all of us here over the years, and certainly for me personally, is breaking risk down into the risk equation. The risk equation, this isn't anything we invented. This is the same risk equation that's really been in use since Napoleon, and from a military point of view. And the formula really is this: risk is threat times vulnerability divided by countermeasures against a particular asset, the thing we're trying to protect. And I mentioned the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors, earlier. They really gave good guidance around this equation, although they didn't call out the equation specifically. When they published their first cyber risk oversight handbook in the early 2000s, and then they revised it again in the 2010s, they talked about critical assets, what's in place to protect them, who are the bad guys. They're really talking about the risk equation here. What's really important is this risk equation turns what we know as practitioners into a business conversation. So if we talk about the threats, the enemy always gets a vote. The bad guys get some say into the things that we do in a cyber program. Considering their means, motive, opportunity, their techniques, their tactics, their procedures, we need to understand what that is because they get a vote in everything that we do. The vulnerability side of the equation, we've been talking about this particular piece for decades in the cybersecurity industry. Where am I vulnerable? How severe is the vulnerability? What would it enable an attacker to do, et cetera? And then the countermeasures are the stuff that we traditionally in cyber pay a lot of attention to, the controls. How well are my firewalls working? How well is my endpoint detection response working? Do I have monitoring in place? All of those list of 200 or something controls. But using it in this way, using the risk equation and stacking that up against what is the business and how does the business operate, is a really powerful way for us to continue to pay attention to the details that we need to pay attention to, but also turn the conversation from a technical and a security-centric conversation into a business conversation.
Yep.
One thing that I'm often asked is how do we do this in a way that matches how other industries talk about risk, like the financial services industry? And Philip, you've spent a lot of time in the financial services industry. You know more about cybersecurity in that space than any of us here. Talk to me a little bit about how the cyber risk is different from the kind of financial modeling that happens on financial risk, credit risk, market risk, those other risky things that are quantified out there in the wild.
Yeah, and it's exactly your point, right? You have to be able to risk can't be an ephemeral, like, shadowy boogeyman hanging out somewhere. You have to tether it to how the business generates revenue and what they do to make money. Financial services industries, right? It's very easy to quantify the exposure because attackers don't have to monetize what they're going after for a financial institution. It's already money. So having that conversation, and you would think, oh, well, we reduce loss from fraud, but that understanding their business model, you have to take into account things like banks have insurance against that. So it tempers their risk tolerance for stuff like that. Same be true like that hospitality, for example, right? It's very easy to have a conversation about the technology controls around protecting guests' information, but then continuing that into potentially even physical security or IT controls that control the locks on doors in a hotel. Aligning that with what has a real impact for the business and how they could potentially lose revenue or experience an increase in expenditures really makes that risk palpable and real.
This is certainly a lot harder in cyber, right? A lot of the risks that we face tend to be, they feel more ethereal. There's much more of that shadowy, the bad guys might get us if we don't do this thing or that thing. And we don't have some of the risk quantification methods that these other industries have. If you look at some risk quantification methods like FAIR or what the financial services industry uses, or even insurance with actuarial tables, we don't have a lot of that data in cyber. We don't have 200 years of actuarial data or 100 years of actuarial data about driving cars, for instance. In the insurance industry, we can quantify the risk of a 16-year-old male driving a Mustang GT, right? They're going to pay more for car insurance because statistically speaking, they're more likely to crash the car. We don't really have that depth of actuarial data and hundreds of years or decades of risk quantification. So breaking cyber risk down in this way, risk, threat, vulnerability countermeasures against an asset, is really a way for us to get as close as we can to quantifying some of the things that could potentially happen and some of the options for dealing with them in a way that doesn't force us to kind of create numbers. And I think a lot of cybersecurity practitioners, we get in trouble because we try and quantify this stuff to make it as precise as some of these other industries. And the reality is that we're just not there yet as a profession to be able to do that. Maybe a half a generation from now, we'll have enough actuarial data to be able to effectively really quantify cyber risk. But today, this is kind of as good as it gets when it comes to turning technical cyber conversations into a business-centric risk conversation. Want to talk a little bit, and then Philip, I'd like to toss it back over to you. I want to talk a little bit about some of the mistakes that we make in our profession, and first and foremost, and it's really endemic in our industry. It's a big problem for us, and that is we overload executives with our language. We talk about cybersecurity specific stuff, and they don't really truly understand the business risk because we haven't translated it into a language that's effective for business stakeholders. The other thing that gets us into trouble is we focus on threats instead of business impact. And really, after the big retail breaches of the early 2000s, where we had a lot of big credit card breaches, millions and millions of records, a lot of retailers that you would recognize the name of that were all over the news. Business got fatigued with us talking about the bad guys because we'd spent so much time creating fear. If we don't buy this firewall or this endpoint protection software, the bad guys are going to get us. And business really shut us down and said, we're tired of hearing about the bad guys. So when we focus only on the threats and we don't focus on the other parts of that risk equation, we start to get into that fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And then the business shuts us down and says, we're really not we're really not interested in hearing this anymore. And then, as I mentioned, that lack of risk quantification. It's not uncommon for especially like CFOs to say, hey, in other parts of the business, we're able to quantify risk better. Why can't you do that in cyber? And as I mentioned in the last slide, and Philip talked a little bit about, we really can't get there from here. Philip, you and I have worked together for, 2 decades, off and on now, and you have an interesting story from the past that we discussed, and this is an example of where we just couldn't. We knew what the risks were, but we just couldn't quite get it right, and the business never really bought into what it was we were trying to communicate to them. You want to share that with the group here?
Oh yeah. So it was the story is one of those, like, it almost sounds like hyperbole. If I hadn't been there, I probably wouldn't have believed it. But we had a root CA was expiring for a pretty extensive internal public key infrastructure environment. And it was just having a lot of difficulty convincing executive management that we needed to devote the resources to rebuilding the root CA. And then it by happenstance, and this was the point at which I joined the Army Reserves. And when I'd come back in between the end of AIT and when we were deploying to Iraq, as we were going through and trying to prove out the case for needing to devote resources to build the root CA, I found the root CA had been installed on a laptop and had put offline, and I discovered the laptop in a communications closet with the hard drive gone.
Mm.
And so we all know what that means. This happened about, I think it was about a month before we deployed, and we continued to push. And I think one of the last things I said before I went on military leave was I would be rather in Iraq with people actively trying to kill me than be here when that root CA expires. When I came back a year and a half later, they had just wrapped up the project to rebuild the root CA.
So really great example, Philip, of the cybersecurity practitioners. I say we, I wasn't there, you were there, but the cybersecurity experts in the room knew that there was this lurking bad thing that was about ready to happen. And we just couldn't get it across to the business. And I think in hindsight, we look at ourselves and say, okay, why couldn't we communicate that risk? And the reality as well is that, business is much more cyber savvy now than it was a decade or two ago. So business stakeholders are more likely to pick up what we're putting down when it comes to communicating risk. But certainly like that's an example of, a PKI infrastructure going down for an enterprise, that's catastrophic. When we think about the cybersecurity triad, confidentiality, integrity, availability, that one touches all of them. And, the notion that it took the disaster to happen before we got the attention necessary as practitioners, pretty powerful.
Our own custom-made denial of service event.
Yeah, very scary, very scary thing indeed. And we see this often where business stakeholders they'll look at the cyber practitioner and say, "Okay, here you go again. Another bad thing is about ready to happen. Sure, sure. You keep telling me this. I keep giving you money. Nothing bad has happened. So why should I worry about this one?" And Greg actually made a comment in the chat regarding cybersecurity and the operational tech environment. Those OT environments are especially nasty when it comes to communicating in terms of risk, because organizations tend to say, "Hey, we got this. We know how to," factories or public utilities, whatever it may be, say, "Yeah, we know how to run machinery. We're good. We don't really need you cyber practitioners telling us that we're doing something wrong. We've been doing this for a long time." When in fact, a lot of those systems have third parties that manage them. They've got VPN connectivity into third parties that may be potentially sketchy. All kinds of things going on there. And the reality is, more often than not, the business stakeholders don't really know what's going on from a true cyber risk perspective. They don't know what the bad guys are doing. They don't know what the control landscape looks like. They don't know the state of vulnerability. And so it's upon us to communicate that in an effective way. Very, very difficult to do. And I think the point of all this really is, the more we can center around that risk equation and turn things into a business conversation, the better off we are in being able to get done what we need to get done on the cyber side. So how do we do this? How do we secure leadership buy-in for a particular security initiative? And I like to start by this. Every time I, as a practitioner, propose a project to the business, and by the way, being a CISO of a managed security services provider, if you think about it for a second, I'm often proposing projects that are cybersecurity projects for not just us, but hundreds of our customers. And so what I have to be able to do is I have to be able to almost take a dry erase marker and write the initiative out on a whiteboard and be able to follow that initiative all the way up through the mission, vision, and purpose of the company and be able to answer the question, how is it that what you want to do in cyber is going to impact the mission, purpose, vision of the company? Are you going to eliminate some risk? Are you going to help drive value? What are you going to do to influence the business in such a way to keep it safe? Mike, having you here in the room, you've had a lot of people of my ilk come to you over the years and ask for money or for buy-in for a particular project. And as a former CIO, you're kind of in triage mode where you've got all kinds of stuff going on with the business. Give us a little bit of insight here on where you've seen practitioners be successful. I want to share a little bit of a war story here on one I have, but I'd really like to hear from you. Like, what do you see successful when security practitioners come to you? They really, honest to goodness, believe that there's something that they need to do, but they've got to convince you to devote the time, the resources in IT, that maybe the finances. What works and what doesn't from the CIO's perspective here?
Well, I think the number one issue that security practitioners have to overcome is being able to tie this to a business initiative. So everybody here, we hear all the time, we need to upgrade the firewall. Well, we all know we need a firewall, but why? Why are we doing this? Tell me the business case for it. What's it going to add value for the organization? And give us a kind of a background of why it's important. Then let's talk about how you're going to go about it. Don't just come with a big dollar sign. So I always sent people back when they came to me with a dollar sign and said, hey, we need to do this because, whatever the because is. I want to know why we're doing it. I want to know what the timeline what are the risks of not doing it? Is do nothing an option? So give me that whole background so that we can frame it in terms of something that we could take on to other leadership and say, okay, this is why we're doing it. This is how it will help you and help the organization. And that's a big step for a lot of practitioners to take, is to actually frame it in terms of why. So.
Mike, you mentioned do nothing, and I thought I would share with the broader group here that it took me years to get to the point where I was comfortable with that answer as a cyber practitioner. Because as a cyber guy, I always wanted to say, well, no, we have to solve this problem. That there are bad guys out here. There's a thing that needs to get done. And it took years for me to get comfortable with the idea of, as long as I clearly communicate the risk, it might be a perfectly acceptable answer for the business to say, given all the other things that this business has going on, we're going to go ahead and accept that risk for the time being. And I think where I've come to in this is, as long as I do my job and communicate the risk appropriately, I can be okay with that answer and sleep at night. Where I get myself in trouble is if I don't do my level best to use the risk equation, communicate the risk to the business, they accept the risk. If I haven't done an adequate job of describing what the potential consequences that you mentioned are, what happens if we do nothing, what are the risks associated with doing something, then I get nervous and I don't sleep well at night because we've got this latent risk out here that the business might not know about.
Right. I think understanding the risk tolerance in general is really, for the whole organization, is really important. I've run into a lot of well-funded organizations in the last couple of years who the answer is, I can write a check. And so when you bring up the risk situation, whatever that may be, and you do exactly what you described, you do your job and you tell them what the problem is, more than likely the answer will be, I can just write a check. Because these are very
Right.
well-funded organizations. It's something that's really hard to hear, but and it's surprising, but sometimes that's the answer.
Right. We saw that a lot in the early days of PCI, right, where the fines weren't quite as toothy as they are today, and so organizations would say, "Okay, should I spend $1 million to be PCI compliant, or should I write $100,000 check to my bank every year for being in violation of the PCI standard?" And you see less of that today with that particular standard, but uh, certainly it's an option, and that risk tolerance, risk acceptance thing is a big part of it. Do I have the financial ability to absorb whatever the consequence of not doing anything might be? Maybe the answer is, yeah, okay, I'll go ahead and take that risk. We tend to talk a lot in our industry. I see this all over LinkedIn, and it really grates on me to have a pet peeve here for a moment. We talk about being business enablers, cybersecurity being business enablers, and I really don't subscribe to that. I think we want to be business influencers. At the end of the day, we're here to protect organizations. That's kind of the genesis of the cybersecurity profession. We're here to facilitate the risk conversation. We're here to execute on the decisions that are made around the risk conversation. But it's a stretch for us to call ourselves business enablers. We should be business influencers and not just a cost center, not just a quote an insurance policy, which is how a lot of businesses view us. So how do we get there from here? What's the way that that we move from being a net uh, business cost center to someone who's actually having an impact on the business? And I think first and foremost, it's about shifting the perception of cybersecurity, and really using our skills to highlight to the business where we can help with those different parts of the risk equation. Philip, you've been running security programs for a long time, and you've had, for many, many years, you've had responsibility for governance, risk, and compliance within the organizations that you've served. These can often be viewed as just sunk cost, right? Businesses go, "Oh, yeah, I got to be compliant, I got to do the thing, and I'm going to spend the money, and Philip's going to yell at me every quarter and tell me how much more money he needs and whatnot." You've done this successfully. How? How have you changed that paradigm into being a business partner and influencer instead of the, okay, here comes Philip again asking for more money?
Yeah, it really just kind of coming to terms with and swallowing the concept that security as a business does not generate revenue, right? Unless you're an MSSP, uh, that it's easy to view security as just a cost center that doesn't do anything for the business, right? It's making the understanding that the value that we can bring to an organization is either the prevention of the loss of revenue, or reducing expenditure. And in a large enterprise, right? I mean, there can oftentimes be opportunities to, as an example, consolidating audit activity, right? If you've got multiple regulatory frameworks that you're aligning against, maybe being able to pull those into a single audit firm, or if you're auditing multiple business units and larger enterprises against the same regulatory framework, being able to consolidate those and go, okay, identify common controls that are being leveraged by these business units like human resources, email, finance, and then just audit the business unit specific control where they potentially differ, and you get to a point where you can be you're seen as an assistant for the business and helping them because you're reducing overhead for their compliance obligations. If you can take HR and tell them, okay, we're still going to commit to the same volume of audit or assessment activity reporting, but we're going to put you in a position to only have to talk to auditors once instead of 7 times, right? Then you become an enabler, and you become something that helps them influence how they are implementing those controls across the entirety of the enterprise. They begin to see the benefit of, oh, if we have a common control that exists across all of the business units, we only have to talk about that thing one time.
Yeah, this is really powerful, Philip, and I've watched you execute on this several times over the course of our shared career, and I think my takeaway from all of this is there is pain for everyone in an organization regarding cybersecurity, right? Just like there's pain for everyone in any other regulatory thing you have to do or compliance thing you have to do. And when I look at any organization, where that pain tends to manifest itself the most are HR, finance, shared services parts of the business. And you talk to these people about cybersecurity, and they all just kind of pound their head against the desk and say, "Oh my goodness, I'm audit fatigue. I'm getting beat up all the time." And as a practitioner, if I can take some of that load off of these teams by auditing them, Philip, as you said, just one time, and then using that for my third party risk assessments, using that for my independence. If I let's say, for instance, I have a multiple of SOC 2 Type 2s that I need to do in an organization, or I have a PCI audit and a HIPAA audit and a SOC 2 Type 2 that I need to do. If I can ease some of that burden, I become a business influencer, and that gives me the keys then to go back to, let's say, HR, using that example. There are a lot of business processes that HR usually owns, especially around identity and provisioning and whatnot, that we cyber people really need to bolt onto those processes. So if I can take some of the load off of those business stakeholders when I need to change a process, I'm now a business influencer, and I can go back to them and say, look, as an example, in our identity program, I really need our HRIS to be the system of truth for identity. I really need to anchor our identity governance and administration platform off of what HR is assigning people for roles when they're onboarded at the company. We really don't get the right to do that as practitioners if HR, finance are used to just being beaten to death by audits. And so I think that this is a technique, Philip, that you and the people that you work with have used over the decades that's really successful. Um, and I want to wrap that around, what do executives care about, right? They care about revenue, they care about risk and liability, and they care about the business being up and available and constantly running. And by the way, which one of those three are most important? It depends on the stakeholder, depends on the industry, depends on the day even. But in general, business executives really care about these three things. So if I can help in any one of those areas, I kind of earned the right to be a business influencer instead of a sunk cost. Um, Philip, back to this for a moment. We we kind of talked about compliance a little bit
Mhm.
in the last slide, and compliance, security, governance. These terms are thrown about all of the time. Um, how do we talk about these things with non-technical stakeholders? And in your mind, when we're in front of a business and we're talking about governance or we're talking about compliance, I've got a few thoughts on this. But first, I'd really like to double click on something you said in the last slide, and that is this idea of creating value by virtue of eliminating liability or risk. How do we have that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it's the that you talk about security and governance and compliance, right? I mean, and this is a conversation, Jared, you and I have had over the almost the entirety of our career, right? Compliance is not security. Uh, the being able to frame the conversation around risk, is that not amorphous thing that's floating in the background? Because security is a risk exposure over time, right? Uh, the longer a vulnerability exists, the more likely it is that it's going to be exploited, and the juicier the target, the shorter that timeline gets. Being able to communicate that to business leadership really becomes difficult sometimes when tying it to what the business actually does to generate revenue. The compliance, right? That the loss of expenditure in compliance, where risk is a potential loss over a period of time and almost sort of a gamble. Compliance is a point in time that you can see coming, right? You could talk about the potential for compromise of a web service with PII on it or what have you, but it's very easy to communicate to leadership that if we don't put these controls in place, we will fail this audit and lose this much money on this date. right? And so kind of sitting between those two worlds of very finite versus somewhat subjective, but being able in both cases to tie those back to, doing these things to potentially prevent the loss of revenue from, the an exploit that puts us in the newspaper and people move away from us for business, loses us revenue. Failing a compliance obligation by not having a control in place and functional is an expenditure, right? You can reduce that by saying, if we do these things, we're not subjected to this expenditure.
It's interesting how powerful compliance is in our profession. Most security programs are run purely by virtue of compliance initiatives, right? They're budgeted based on compliance. The share of voice that security practitioners have in a business is often directly proportionate to how regulated that business is. If you look at the most heavily regulated industries, they're the financial services and healthcare industries, and therefore they tend to have the largest cybersecurity budgets and the largest compliance requirements compared to other non-regulated industries. But there's a very interesting thing here. If we use risk properly in our profession, compliance begins to become a side effect of good security. And that's really what we're after. If I had to go worldwide and look for the most informed people around compliance regulations, it'd be China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. They know what the regulations are, and they know the bare minimum that companies are using to run their cybersecurity programs. We don't want to give them the window of opportunity in order to, execute a compromise against a business because of a gap between regulatory compliance and security. But that gap is the one that's often very difficult for us to fill because of all the things that we mentioned earlier. And so, really kind of flipping the conversation, flipping the script, and saying, look, let's talk about risk. Let's have a risk-centric conversation. We know there's this stuff over here we have to do to be compliant. But if I'm having a risk conversation, and I view compliance as just another threat vector. It's another, essentially, I mentioned the enemy gets a vote. Well, in the case of compliance, the enemy, in this case, the adversary, is maybe a regulator that has different tools than a hacker. But they're there to create pain. And so if I frame all this in terms of the risk conversation, what can happen is I start to get compliant as a result of having a secure organization, and the compliance becomes a side effect. Super powerful. A great example of this is, I hear a lot of my customers talking about CMMC. And the driver for CMMC is, if you want to do business with the defense industrial base, you kind of have to be compliant with this, this standard. And the standard it can be very arduous depending upon the level of compliance. However, the controls that are in there are the same controls that are found in ISO 27002. They're the same controls that are found in NIST 853, a subset of them anyway. They are a subset of NIST 853. If I'm doing the right things and managing risk, I have a very short leap in order to be CMMC compliant. There are a few controls in there that are a little difficult, but if I'm having that risk conversation, I don't have to do the whipsaw reaction to the latest, compliance driver or regulation of the day. Really powerful stuff. Philip, you've done a great job with this over the years, and I think it's a testament to that when a new regulation comes online, like CMMC, or even, the new ISO standard around AI governance, where we're not having that whipsaw reaction to, an emerging regulation. It's just another threat actor that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, and that's the same thing that we've said over the 20 odd years of sitting around complaining about work is that compliance is only security at the lowest common denominator based on the kind of data you're handling or the service that you're providing, right? And to your point, right, none of these security controls are alien technologies. They're all saying the same thing largely in different ways, and they're just found in different parts of the document. So really just kind of aligning those as an overarching security program, and then ensuring that the security that you're implementing is enough for the business, by virtue of adhering to that security program, you get close enough to compliance or across that compliance finish line that, adhering to that regulatory requirement is a non-event.
Right, right.
Yeah.
It's really a fantastic approach to take with this. Want to share a little bit about a challenge that I experienced with a team of mine years ago, and kind of how we put all this together to make it work. So the challenge was I happened to work for a food company at the time, and I'm running the security program for this food company. And leadership really wasn't too interested in, all of the little, quote, little cybersecurity initiatives that I had. They cared about them. They were serious about cybersecurity, but my initiatives just weren't hitting the mark. When I propose a project or I'd ask for funding, and I remember I walked into a board meeting, and I had my security practitioner peacock feathers all out, and I walked in there like, all right, I'm going to get some money for these projects. And as I mentioned, food company, right? So I do my presentation on credit card security and network encryption and database, data encrypted at rest and obfuscation. And one of the board members looked at me and said, JR, that's really great. How does this compare to salmonella in terms of corporate risk? Again, food company, right? And so I was stopped in my tracks. I had to fold my little peacock feathers back and kind of put my head down a little bit and go, uh-oh, I'm out of my league here. And it was a really powerful lesson. I'm so grateful that happened. What I realized was I was talking to executives that knew everything there was to know about food. Food safety, food regulations, food production, food, the economics of food, and they knew very little about cybersecurity. I had to start speaking in their language. So I went back and I started asking questions of the business like, well, tell me about salmonella. How do you deal with it? And I learned all kinds of stuff like we measure the food at different parts of its traversal of the food chain, the supply chain. We have all these different food safety measures. We have all these different auditors that do this stuff. And it clicked. Okay, I need to take my risk equation and I need to communicate with these folks in terms that they understand. So instead of talking about encryption of data at rest, I started talking about the contamination of data or unauthorized access that would be no different than unauthorized access to food in the food production life cycle. And I really modified the risk equation to match how the business was doing enterprise risk management. And what happened? First of all, I learned a whole lot more about food production than I ever thought I would ever know in my life. But I became a more effective communicator and ended up having more engaged executives. The board was more in tune to what I was up to, almost to the point where they made more effort to understand what I was doing on the cyber side because I was making the effort to communicate in terms, that they could understand. So that was an example of how, by the way, I knew from the get-go what needed to get done. I was really concerned about network segmentation, credit card security, all the PCI centric stuff. And we're really concerned about corporate and trade secrets and those types of things, right? All the stuff that cybersecurity practitioners are concerned with. But I wasn't speaking in their language, and I had to use that risk equation in a way that was meaningful to the business. And Mike brought up a point earlier, and that was in order to do that, you have to understand what the business does and how it works. There are so many cyber practitioners that really don't understand the nuts and bolts of what makes a business unique. What is its value proposition to humanity? Why does it make money? Why does it have the margins that it has? What are the business risks outside of cyber that are relevant? Once we begin to understand those things, it gives us a little bit of a license to, again, be a business influencer. We might not be a business enabler, but being a business influencer and being able to protect the organization is really what we're after. With that, let's talk takeaways real quick. I hope you got something out of this, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A. Mike, if you would, you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but talk about these top three, right? And as a CIO and a CISO, the importance of those.
Well, as a CIO, we have to be able to understand why we exist as an IT team, and why you exist is to support the business functions. If you can understand, like you just said, the business function, why you exist, what the revenue model is, what all of those components, you're able to start tying individual risks to the impact of the overall organization. I mean, you could be a car manufacturer, you could be an architecture firm, you could be whatever it is. If the practitioner is able to say, okay, I understand what your function is, and I understand what the impact is on me making changes, then I can translate risk into an enabler or an influencer, whatever you want to call it, for the business. The investment part is very difficult because a lot of these organizations, you're running on a really small margin. I mean, most organizations are 1 to 2% of the overall revenue that they're providing to security. So we have to make sure that we understand the goals. We understand why we would be making these security investments in order to support those goals. I see that as a CIO and a CISO function. You have to understand those things and you work together. And then engaging leadership, you have to tell really compelling, as you put here, compelling narratives, great stories. Something I've used over the years is like building a road. So if you understand what the goals are, you understand why the business exists, then you can be out strategically looking forward and say, okay, these are the changes that might be happening to this organization, and here's how IT can help support those changes. A lot of times a leader their ears will perk up and they'll go, oh, okay, tell me more. Well, it's like building a road. I build that road out there so you can drive on it. If you don't have that road and you go and you create some business strategic effort and that road's not there, now we have a disconnect. So we have to understand those two things together, build the road together, and then the business can drive on it. So I think that that's usually something that resonates with leadership.
Yeah, this is great. Mike, I really appreciate, your insight of this. You have such a unique perspective. Philip, what are your thoughts on this? Obviously, you come at it from a little bit of a different angle, given, your areas of responsibility throughout your career. If someone's going to take something away from this conversation today, what is it?
Yeah, it's very easy and in my case, almost preferable, right? To have blinders on and just drill down into that technical problem, right? Everyone kind of thinks of themselves almost like the Incredible Hulk, right? Just get me close enough to the problem and I'll solve it. But as Mike said, right, it's really about being able to align what you're doing with how or really why the business exists, and then just being able to show them like, hey, it's those two things that we have, right? We can either prevent the loss of revenue or reduce expenditure. And if you can tether to one of those two things, those conversations get a lot easier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great stuff. Guys, you're the best in the business at this. It's been a real pleasure to talk about this topic with you. It is one of the more artsy side of our profession, as opposed to being the scientific side that a lot of other things are. For those of you who invested the time in us, I hope you got something out of this. My little takeaway for everyone is, first of all, use that risk equation, very powerful. We've got an ebook out here, reframing cybersecurity. Would love it if you downloaded that and took a look at it. We put some time into it and really tried to put all of this stuff together in a way that you've got some takeaways. For me, that risk equation has been super powerful, throughout my career. And so, really appreciate everybody being here. Before we get to Q&A, Gina, I'll hand it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you, all three of you, for sharing such great advice for our audience today. We should have a couple minutes for questions if anyone out there wants to put anything into the chat or the Q&A tab. We'll be taking a look at that. And right now, I just wanted to quickly mention our next webinar, which will be on April 30th, where we were going to be revealing our first quarterly threat report for this year, 2025. So be on the lookout for invitations to attend that if you're interested. JR mentioned the ebook, so we have that to share as well. I'm going to post all these links for you that are relevant to this conversation in the chat right now, but never fear, they'll be in the email we send out tomorrow as well. So there are those, and of course our website is full of fantastic cybersecurity resources. Take a glance at your convenience. But these are just our most recent and most relevant checklists, ebooks, articles that we have for you right now. And with that, I would like to go to questions here. All right. So let's go to this question. So I think you did a great job already answering this, JR, with your food service story. But anything else to add on how to handle a situation where leadership doesn't immediately see the urgency of a security investment?
Sure. Yeah, it's obviously we're all used to that happening. I will say this, we get really accustomed to hitting executives over the head with security metrics. We got all these fancy metrics on this is how many vulnerabilities I have, and this is how many times the bad guys tried to get in and all this stuff. Metrics tell, but stories sell. So if I'm trying to get an executive to really see an initiative, I need to have the data to support what I'm after, but I also need to tie it into a real world example of something that's going on. I can have all the data in the world that says that I have thousands of critical vulnerabilities, but until I tell the story of here's who the bad guys are that are trying to exploit that vulnerability, here's how long it would take them, and here's what the risk equation looks like, that those metrics are meaningless. So I think that's probably the only thing I didn't mention when I was talking about speaking with executives is, don't use the metrics as the hammer to hit people over the head. Use them as a reinforcement mechanism for the story that you're telling about the problem that you want to solve. Good question.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you for that question. All right, we have one here for Mike. What are some tangible ways to demonstrate that cybersecurity initiatives reduce risk and enhance competitive advantage?
Well, of course, there's metrics that JR just talked about. Everybody wants to show numbers. They want to say reduce number of incidents. That doesn't tell a good story. When you can tie it to a business function, it does. So, for instance, cybersecurity insurance is a big deal for most organizations, and you want to keep your premiums as low as possible. In order to do that, you need to meet certain compliance goals. If you can tie that compliance need to lower premiums, that's a good way to communicate it. Talk about a sales life cycle, for example. You're selling some widget to an organization and they want you to fill out their security questionnaire. That's a time suck, usually. So if you can have your SOC reports or your ISO reports, and I think Philip mentioned this a little bit, if you have that all ready to go, you can turn that around and your sales cycle will benefit from that. And you can probably prove that by doing it before and after analysis of, how fast are you able to close a sale. So those are some real good examples of how you can tie those things together.
Perfect. I love that. All right. Thanks, Mike. And then we'll just I think we have time for one more. So here's one for Philip. What role does governance play in aligning business and security priorities? I think you covered a little bit of this. Anything else to add?
Yeah, a lot of it's really from a governance perspective is just making sure that what you're doing on a security side is aligning with what you need to do on a compliance side, for regulatory or contractual obligations, what have you, and then the compliance just becomes a byproduct of the security.
Makes sense. All right. Well, we are right at the end here. Perfect timing. We appreciate everyone who did put in questions. But if you come up with any other questions for us, you can email us at securitywebinars@pditechnologies.com. Also, upon exiting the webinar, there is a short survey that will pop up, and we'd certainly appreciate any feedback that you have for us today. We're always looking for ideas for upcoming webinar topics. So that's a great way to give us any feedback you have. At this point, any closing thoughts from any of you speakers today?
I'd just like to say, Gina, thank you so much for putting this together. You make these things go, and hopefully we're giving the industry something that that makes us all better practitioners. Really appreciate you and the team putting this together, promoting it, the scheduling, and getting all of us together. So thank you, Gina. Thank you, team.
Yeah. And if anyone could take anything away from this, if you're having a conversation with executives, don't lead with anything that you would read in a config file.
Good one. All right. On behalf of PDI Security and Network Solutions and our presenters, thank you all for joining us and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone.
everyone.